I need you to stop for a second, because what I am about to tell you completely changed how I see global conflicts, and once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. This isn't about politics. This isn't about news headlines. This is about a pattern so obvious, yet so ignored, that it might explain why some wars never go the way they're promised. And right now I believe we're standing on the edge of the most dangerous version of that pattern yet. I started noticing something strange. Every time the United States got involved in a war in the Middle East, the story always sounded the same in the beginning. I remember hearing it again and again. This will be quick. This will be controlled. This will be controlled. This will be worth it. But when I look back at what actually happened, the reality didn't match the promise. Iraq in 2003, it was supposed to be fast. Libya in 2011, it was supposed to bring stability. Syria, it was supposed to be manageable. But none of them stayed small. Instead, what followed was something much messier, something far more chaotic than anyone expected. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just coincidence. It was a pattern where the beginning of a war is always framed as limited, but the outcome becomes unpredictable, uncontrollable, and often far worse than what came before. And now, when I look at what's happening today, I can't ignore the feeling that we might be walking straight into that same pattern again, except this time the stakes feel much higher. Because this time, the conversation isn't about a weak or unstable country. This time it's about Iran. And something tells me if this situation turns into a full conflict, it won't stay contained, not even close. To understand why this moment feels so dangerous to me, I have to go way back. Not a few years, not even a few decades. I'm talking about 1953. That's where I realized this story really begins. I remember digging into it and thinking, why does this date keep coming up? And the more I looked into it, the more everything started to make sense. Back then, Iran had a democratically elected leader. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. And from what I learned, he made one decision that changed everything. He wanted Iran to control its own oil. At first, that might sound reasonable, right? A country wanting control over its own resources. But in that moment, it wasn't just about Iran anymore, because powerful countries were already deeply dependent on that oil. So instead of letting that happen, something else happened. A covert operation. I remember reading how intelligence agencies from the US, reading how intelligence agencies from the US and the UK worked behind the scenes to remove him from power. And just like that, the leadership changed. A new ruler was installed, one who aligned much more closely with Western interests. And for years after that, Iran wasn't really acting independently. It was more like it was being guided. But here's the part that really stuck with me. That kind of control doesn't last forever, because eventually people push back. And that's exactly what happened. In 1979, everything flipped. There was a revolution. The old system collapsed, foreign influence was rejected, and a completely new government took over. And from that moment on, everything changed between Iran and the United States. It wasn't always open conflict. There weren't always bombs or soldiers. But when I looked at it closely, it felt like something else was happening. A silent conflict, sanctions, covert actions, proxy tensions. It was like a war. Conflict tensions. It was like a war, just without officially calling it one. And the longer I studied it, the more I started to see it this way. This isn't a new conflict. This is something that's been building, slowly, quietly, for decades. And now I can't help but wonder, what happens when something like that finally reaches its breaking point? At this point, I realized something important. I couldn't just look at headlines anymore. I couldn't rely on what people say is happening. So I started asking myself a different question. How do I actually figure out what's really going on here? And that's when I built a simple way of looking at things. Not perfect, but it changed how I see conflicts like this. I began focusing on three things. First, I look at what I call the reality you can't change. Not opinions, not speeches. I'm talking about facts that exist no matter what anyone says. Geography, population, resources. Things that shape a country whether we like it or not. Second, I try to understand what each side actually wants. Not what they say on TV. Not the public statements. I mean the real motivations, the kind you only see when you follow power, money, and long-term strategy. And third, I look at patterns from history. Because one thing I've noticed is this. People change. Leaders change. But behavior, it repeats. The same mistakes. The same overconfidence. The same belief that this time will be different. the same belief that this time will be different. And most of the time, it isn't. So I took this way of thinking and I applied it to one simple question. What really happens if a war starts between the United States and Iran? And the first thing that hit me, almost immediately, was something I think a lot of people completely underestimate. Iran is not Iraq. I had to repeat that to myself a few times because it sounds simple, but it changes everything. When I look back at Iraq in 2003, I saw a country that had already been weakened for years. Sanctions had drained it, previous wars had damaged its military. Even internally, it was divided. By the time the invasion happened, it was already fragile. But Iran feels completely different. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized, if people are expecting the same kind of outcome, they might be making a very serious mistake. This is where things really started to shift for me. Because once I stopped comparing everything to past wars and actually looked at Iran on its own, I realized how different this situation really is. I remember sitting there thinking, why does this feel heavier? And then I saw it. First, scale. Iran isn't a small country, it's massive. We're talking about a population of around 90 million people. That's not just a number. That's a completely different level of complexity. And then there's geography. This isn't flat desert where armies can move easily. Iran is full of mountains, rough terrain, and natural barriers, the kind that slows down even the most advanced military in the world. But what really caught my attention was preparation. This isn't a country that would be caught off guard. From everything I've seen, Iran has spent decades preparing for one specific scenario, a potential conflict with a much stronger military, and instead of trying to match power directly, it looks like they adapted. Underground facilities, scattered production sites, smaller, harder to detect systems. It's not about being stronger, it's about being harder to break. And then there's something even more important, something I think most people overlook, the people. Because when I look at past conflicts, I notice something. Internal division makes a country weaker. But with Iran, it doesn't seem that simple. Yes, there are disagreements inside the country. Yes, there are frustrations. But history shows something interesting. When an outside force steps in, those internal differences tend to disappear. People unite, not because everything is perfect, but because the threat becomes bigger than the disagreements. And when that happens, you're no longer dealing with just a military. You're dealing with an entire population that refuses to back down. That's a completely different kind of challenge. And the more I think about it, the more one question keeps coming back to me. If a conflict starts under these conditions, how exactly does it stay small? This is the part that honestly unsettled me the most, because up until now everything I looked at was leading to one assumption, that if a conflict starts, it can somehow be controlled. But the deeper I went, the less that idea made sense. I started asking myself a simple question. What does a war like this actually look like on day one? And the answer I found wasn't simple at all. Because this wouldn't just be one country versus another. It wouldn't be clean. It wouldn't be isolated. It would trigger reactions. Fast. I began to see it like a chain reaction, where one move instantly activates multiple others. Not weeks later. Not months later. Almost immediately. Different groups across the region, groups that are already connected in different ways, wouldn't just sit back and watch. They would respond. And, not in a small way. Shipping routes could suddenly become unsafe. Key trade paths could be disrupted. And when that happens, it's not just a regional issue anymore, it becomes global. Because so much of the world depends on those routes staying open. At the same time, pressure would start building from multiple directions. Not just on one front, but several. And that's when it really clicked for me. This wouldn't feel like a single war. It would feel like multiple conflicts happening at once, all connected. And the more connections there are, the harder it becomes to control anything. Because even if one side tries to limit things, the other moving pieces don't just pause, they escalate, independently. And suddenly something that may have started as a targeted strike turns into something much bigger much faster than anyone expected. That's the danger. Not just the conflict itself, but how quickly it stops being what it was supposed to be. And once that line is crossed, it's almost impossible to go back. This is where it stopped feeling like a distant conflict to me and started feeling personal. Because I realized something most people don't think about. Even if a war happens far away, you still end up paying for it. Maybe not with weapons, but with your daily life. I started looking into one specific area, energy. And the more I understood it, the more everything connected. There's a narrow passage in that region that a huge portion of the world's oil moves through every single day. Not a small amount, a massive share of global supply. Now imagine this, not a full shutdown, not even something permanent, just a disruption. Not even something permanent, just a disruption, even a partial slowdown. That alone would be enough to shake the entire system. Prices wouldn't rise slowly, they would spike. Fuel becomes expensive, transportation costs go up. And once that happens, everything else follows. Food, goods, basic necessities, because almost everything we use at some point depends on energy to move, produce, or deliver. And that's when I realized this isn't just about governments or militaries. This hits ordinary people first. Grocery bills start climbing. Travel becomes expensive. Businesses struggle with rising costs. And it doesn't matter where you live. Whether it's the US, Europe, Asia, or anywhere else, the effect spreads, quietly but quickly. And then there's another layer to this that made it even more serious. Major global powers aren't disconnected from this region. They rely on it. Which means if something threatens that flow, they don't just watch, they react. And now you're not just dealing with one conflict anymore. You're dealing with multiple powerful countries, all trying to protect their own interests at the same time. And when that happens, the situation becomes a lot harder to predict, because now it's not just about one decision, it's about many decisions happening all at once, and not all of them align. That's when things can move from complicated to uncontrollable. This is the part I almost didn't want to think about. Because once I reached this point, the conversation changed completely. Up until now, everything I looked at was about conflict, escalation, economics. But this is something else. I started asking myself a question that most people avoid. What happens when a country feels like its survival is at risk? Not pressure, not sanctions. I mean real existential threat. Because history shows something very clear. When survival is on the line, countries stop thinking in normal terms. They start thinking in extremes. And that's when the idea of nuclear capability enters the conversation. Now I want to be very careful here. This isn't about assuming what will happen. It's about understanding the pressure. Because if a country believes that a full-scale attack could threaten its existence, then the logic shifts. Deterrence becomes everything. The ability to say, if you go further, the consequences will be unbearable. And once that mindset takes hold, it doesn't stay isolated. Other countries start watching closely, and they begin asking their own questions. If one country moves in that direction, what does that mean for us? And that's how something regional starts spreading beyond borders. Because no country wants to be left vulnerable. No country wants to fall behind in a situation where power suddenly matters more than ever been. And this is where things can escalate in a way that's very hard to reverse. Not overnight, but step by step. One decision leads to another. One reaction triggers the next. And before anyone realizes it, the situation isn't just about one conflict anymore. It's about a shift in how multiple countries think about security itself. That's what makes this moment so sensitive. Not just what's happening right now, but what it could lead to if things keep moving in the same direction. And the truth is, once that kind of momentum builds, slowing it down becomes incredibly difficult. After going through all of this, I came to a conclusion that I didn't expect. At first, I thought the biggest danger was the war itself. But now, I don't think that's true anymore. I think the real danger is something else, the belief that it can be controlled. Because when I look at history, I see the same mindset repeating over and over again, a belief that power guarantees control, that precision guarantees success, that this time things will go according to plan. But that's not what history shows. I kept thinking about past conflicts, how they started with confidence, and slowly turned into something far more complicated. And then I asked myself, what actually determines the outcome of a war? It's not just technology. It's not just firepower. It's resilience. It's geography. It's the will of people to keep going, even when the cost becomes unbearable. And when I apply that thinking here, I see a problem, because even the most powerful military in the world has limitations. Air power can strike, it can damage, it can disrupt, but it doesn't always decide the final outcome. And if a conflict reaches the point where ground reality matters, where control of land, people, and time becomes the deciding factor, that's when things become extremely difficult to manage. And then there's something even more subtle, but just as important. Cost. Not just human cost, but economic cost. I came across something that really stuck with me. In modern conflicts, defending against certain attacks can be far more expensive than launching them. And if that imbalance continues over time, it slowly drains even the strongest systems. Not instantly, but steadily. And when you combine that with rising economic pressure, public opinion, global reactions, you start to see a bigger picture forming, one where there's no clear endpoint, no simple definition of winning, just a situation that keeps demanding more with less certainty of success. And that's when the final question hit me. If a conflict has no clear end and no clear victory, then what exactly are you stepping into? Because once it starts, stopping it isn't always a choice anymore. And maybe that's the part we should be paying the most attention to. Not how powerful the beginning looks, but how uncertain the ending might be.